Apologies for being quiet for a while. I was part way into making a new film, and as part of that I wanted to include something revolving on a turntable. Back in 2020, when I did my Vice refurb, I cobbled together a gearbox from junk that was just barely good enough for the shot, safe in the knowledge that one day I'd make something a bit more permanent. Well, of course I never did make something a bit more permanent. There always seemed to be something more pressing to be getting on with. Until now, that is. I paused the film that I was making and moved on to a turntable side project. As filming something usually doubles or triples the time it takes to get it finished, I decided not to video anything, just to crack on and maybe take a few stills. Little did I know, I was creating a monster. The starting point was a surplus 200-watt brushless motor I'd had hanging around. I'd recently figured out how to make it run, and knocked up a crude soft start and speed control with an Arduino Nano clone. I was surprised at just how smooth and torquey it was, right down to about 60 RPM. Now 1 rev a second was a bit quick for what I had in mind, but I figured it wouldn't take too much gearing down to make it usable. In a bit of a homage to Tim Hunkin, I thought I'd have a go with chains because, well, I've never used them before. A few days later I had some chain and sprockets courtesy of AliExpress, and I could start thinking about how I could put it all together. I got a pair of 65 and a pair of 11-tooth sprockets, which together would give me a reduction of a little under 6:1, and when compounded together, a shade under 35:1. With the motor's available speed range, this ought to give me an output of between roughly 1 rev every half minute at the low end, and in theory at least, up to about 40 RPM with the motor flat out. I deliberately chose the sprockets with the largest central hole, so I could hopefully use a hollow spindle that might allow for both a rotating subject in front of a stationary camera and a stationary subject in front of a rotating camera. To get the ball rolling, I started at the motor end. It came with a type of jaw coupling, which didn't suit my needs, so I adapted it to take the small 11-tooth wheel. For some reason, I convinced myself I didn't quite have the clearance for a button head, and went ahead and made a special thin section screw, which it turned out I didn't need at all, but I'd made it, so I'm using it. The compound sprocket was going to run on a 10mm stainless shaft, just because I had a piece handy. So I started by making a couple of bearing blocks to support the ends, and fitted 609 bearings that would take the shaft once I reduced the ends to 9mm. Next came making the hubs that would attach the chain wheels to their respective shafts. To save time and money as far as possible, I wanted to use material I already had kicking around. This meant making each part in smaller, more manageable sections that would fasten together, rather than starting with big lumps that would be mostly turned to swarf. Actually, there was quite a bit of swarf in any case. The hub for the compound sprocket was made in 2 parts. An adapter plate to reduce the diameter of the centre hole, made from quarter aluminium plate that wasn't thick enough to accommodate grub screws, and a central boss made from EM1 steel that was thick enough for screws, but on its own not wide enough to fill the hole in the sprocket. The leaded steel cuts beautifully on my little machine, but it also rusts beautifully in my damp garage, so I cold blued and oiled it in the hope that it wouldn't be ruined. I reamed quarter holes in the sprocket and adapter plate, and then made silver steel sleeves that would lock the 2 parts together once M4 screws were installed. I've not many photos of making the first hub, as I got a bit distracted by the bandsaw throwing in the towel. It just kept breaking blades. I think 2 things were going on here. First, the guide bearings were all gritted up with swarf and kept grabbing the blade. I've no idea why someone chose shielded rather than sealed. As luck would have it, I was able to scratch together enough bearings to get it running again. I think the second problem may have been the way the blades had been stored. I bought the saw used and the guy gave me a bunch of blades, which I've been using ever since. They'd all been twisted in on themselves to save space. I imagine this would be okay for getting a 30-foot blade to a manageable size, but I think a triple twist on a 1/2 inch by 1300mm blade may be overstressing the weld. Anyhow, I got it back on the road and carried on. The motor mount was made from some scrap T-slotted aluminium extrusion, as this would give me some adjustability to set the chain tension. It wasn't quite tall enough, so I padded it out with a couple of spacers that needed a radius fly cutting on one side to clear the rebate on the front of the motor. With attaching the motor taken care of, I moved on to the second hub. This was made in pretty much the same way as the first, the difference being that instead of attaching to a 10mm rod, this one would need to work with a piece of hollow steel tube. I turned a piece of quarter aluminium plate that would screw to the sprocket with spacer sleeves and M4 screws, just like the first one. The aluminium central boss was drilled and tapped for 8 M3 screws before having the middle open out to take the steel tube. I slitted the boss and added a pair of clamping screws, so the sprocket's position could be set on the tube after the fact, instead of trying to figure out how everything would sit in relation to everything else right from the beginning. Having a rotating tube would be all well and good, but I'd need a way of balancing what I was filming on the end of it. For this, I turned up a 110mm disc from 10mm plate. I made a collar to attach to the back of the plate with 6 M3 screws. Cutting a keyway to transfer the drive would be difficult, so I made a set of silver steel pins that would pass through the holes in the collar and sit flush with the inner wall of the steel tube. These were hardened and tempered using ClickSpring's boric acid method to minimise scale. The pins are retained in the collar with a simple lock wire, which sits in a groove on the outside edge. The other 3 holes are for grub screws, which are just there to take out any play, rather than provide drive. The weight of the load will be borne by a combination of a 61816 bearing, which sits in a groove under the plate, and a 51106 thrust race positioned at the far end of the steel tube. I've got 8 M6 tapped holes in the turntable plate to give me some options for mounting things securely, should the need arise. Up until this point, I was just making it up as I went along. It was only now, having made most of the components, that I began to realise just how big of a thing I was making. In my mind's eye, the offcut of 6mm aluminium plate I'd saved was going to make me a top, a bottom, and maybe have a few bits left over for the "it might come in handy" box. Before I went any further, I sketched up a 1:1 scale drawing, and it soon became clear that the whole piece, if I was lucky, would only make me a top. As I'd all but run out of stout sheet material, I'd have to buy something to make the bottom of the gearbox. Or is it a chain box? Anyhow, it occurred to me that if I was buying it, it wouldn't cost a boatload more to buy it ready cut, which might save me a bit of time, which would be handy as what was meant to be a quick build was beginning to drag on a bit. Laser cutters all seem to want DXF files, which I can't produce. All the cool kids seem to be using Fusion, so I thought I'd give it a try. And this kind of turned into a sub-side project. About a week later, I'd learnt enough from YouTube to draw a wiggly line, which I sent over to Model Engineers Laser for them to cut from 5mm steel. Whilst I was waiting for that to come back, I carried on by making the bearing holder that the bottom of the tube would sit in. This is just a 90mm aluminium puck with 4 tap mounting holes and a stepped recess to take a pair of bearings. My 51106 thrust race in the bottom and a 6707 a bit further up, which needed some brass sleeves making to make everything fit together nicely. The pillars that would separate the top and bottom plates were made from some scrap oval extrusion I'd rescued from the skip. The ovals were cut to length, and I prepared 2 lengths per pillar of M6 all thread, and then turned up some threaded plastic spacers to help keep everything in position. By now, I had almost all the parts made, and moved on to making the frame the whole contraption would sit on. For this, I'd weld up some 20mm angle iron. I cut the pieces with an angle grinder and tidied them up on the belt sander. A decent welder can turn out good work from a poor fit-up, but I need all the help I can get, so the ends got just a tickle on the mini-mill to get the 45s as close as possible. Next, the pieces got an overnight soak in citric acid. Surprisingly, the metal doesn't come out red rusty, but the mill scale is softened enough to come off easily with a wire brush. This makes it cleaner to handle and easier to weld, but with no protection it does tend to flash rust, hence the slight golden colour. To ready the ends for welding, I dressed back to clean metal with a carbide burr. At least I did, until the armature threw its toys out the pram. I'm no welder, but by my standards the joints are relatively neat and more than adequate for the job. Just as the frame was finished, my laser-cut bottom plate arrived in the post. I used the bottom plate as a template to cut the holes in the top, in the hope that everything would line up and be square once assembled, and there was only one way to find that out. Luckily, it all went together pretty well. A part I knew that I might need, but had pushed to the back of my mind, was a tensioner for the output chain. I just hoped the solution would present itself if the need arose. In spite of it being a fairly large build, I'd ended up with very little spare space where I could fit one. After a route through my tub of bearings, I came up with an idea, but first I had to correct the off-centre hole in my tiny sprocket. Then I turned up a little eccentric post to take up the slack in the chain. So my quick little side project ended up being neither, as it took 3 months to finish and it weighs in at over 13 kilograms. But actually, I'm pretty pleased with it. And where my previous efforts wouldn't pull the skin off a rice pudding, I think it'll be a while before I have to revisit this for lack of power. And I think that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. I hope to see you next time.